All right. Good afternoon, everybody. The long-awaited presentation of why we had first-year students jumping around on pogo-sticks and unicycles, disguised under a research project that Luke and I have both been working on with the help of Marlena and Min. So this is definitely a collaborative effort, not to mention all of those that were involved in the facilitation. So we'll extend our thanks at the end, but just as a pre-thank you to everyone that's contributed to this. Hopefully in the next 30 to 40 odd minutes, we'll be able to share with you the journey we've been on in terms of bringing it to life, the inception, and then also what we learnt and how the students found the whole experience and what that means for us moving forward. So before we get started, just none of this is new to us. We have all taught either first, second or third years in this room. We know the change in demographic and the change of, I guess, student learning modalities that we've seen over the course of the last couple of years. But lo and behold, there has been a bit of research that's gone into this, particularly looking at Generation Z, our current generation of students. And again, as no surprise to us, the sort of three key areas that we're seeing, which is a bit of a difference towards previous cohorts, is the association between the reliance on digital media and digital communication, and then what that then means in terms of face-to-face communication and how they interact and how comfortable they feel coming into essentially a university environment where they have to talk to each other and try new things and basically navigate that space. So yeah, research has pretty much described it into that sort of three key areas: that their social confidence, if it's not in front of a screen, is next to none. And then with that comes hand in hand the anxiety about, I'm not good enough, I shouldn't be here, sort of that imposter syndrome sort of feeling. And then where that then leads to is, if something's too hard, they essentially just don't do it. They avoid it altogether. So again, nothing new to us. We've been battling for this for the last couple of years. And yeah, for those that heard Luke's presentation end of last year, this is exactly why we want to look at how do we change that? How do we change that narrative with our students? So in terms of the first year challenges specifically, this cohort, as we know, a lot of first year stress, the change, moving, whether it's moving home, changing environments, stepping out of that high school environment. With that, there's a lot of research now to suggest that goes hand in hand with having an identity issue as well. So not only is it a new venture for them, they're also going through a lot of self-discovery and, really trying to, reflecting on who they are and who they want to be, and a lot of them just don't know. And then with that sort of then ruminates to psychological stress, which is then a resultant of that is that self-blame. They do something poorly, I'm not good enough. So there's that connection with, if something doesn't go well, that's on them and as a result of them, as opposed to, potentially something outside of their control, or the fact that, that is all a part of life and learning. So building resilience, from all of that research there, and now one of the key areas, as we know, is looking at how do we change that. So we know that competence and resilience, that if they feel comfortable about something, they feel competent, then they're more likely to cope with those challenges. Emotional intelligence, we know that, again, if they've got a higher degree of emotional intelligence and they're more aware of how they're feeling about something, then that helps them adjust to those challenges in academia, with those feelings of resilience and, just generally managing their stress a lot better. So how do we do that? Again, lots of research to suggest there's a few different ways in which we can, but really that key area which we're focusing on today is enhancing resilience. So targeted support, resources, making them feel welcome, and hopefully then in turn that carries on into semester and the subsequent years at uni. So what were we trying to do? The aim of the study and subsequently the workshop in which we delivered is first and foremost to see whether that workshop that we had in week one, accompanied by the lecture, had a difference, on their psychological factors, but then also moving forward, did we see a difference in engagement and, hopefully in grades in semester one? We'll preface this by saying actually measuring that is very tricky. So we sort of had to go on a bit of a deep dive as to other ways in which we could look at that, but we'll get to that shortly. We also wanted to look at the improvements in key psychological factors associated with those things where if they don't go well, you know, the students don't feel that confident. So specifically, we were looking at these key areas. So perfectionism, we know that this generation has quite a high degree of perfectionism, which is goes hand in hand with why if they don't think they're going to nail it, they essentially don't engage in that task. Perceived stress mindset, so having switching from that fixed mindset to growth mindset. Resilience, you know, obviously ability to overcome challenges, the tenacity, their grit, and reducing their fear of failure. So that was what we were hoping to do by giving them some very obscure tasks in a workshop environment and getting them just to try something new together. And then also in terms of, I guess, the practical application, and again, how we were trying to help these students with something that they can take away from the study and the workshops was that they had tools that they could think, okay, if this is hard or I'm exposed to something, you know, moving forward, what can I do about that? You know, so they had that toolbox, so to say, of how to manage those tasks moving forward. And then also just how to navigate that feeling of uncertainty and not being sure of who I am, where I want to be, you know, am I going to be able to do this task successfully or not? So just by nature of the task, the activities that we had, which Luke will talk about in a minute, in combination with just working through those problems with them at those workshops, you know, and making, I guess, us feel accessible in that space, that they could come to us, ask us questions, work through problems collaboratively there. So in terms of the two groups, most of you probably would have been working in semester one for those that were involved with the experimental group. So this was our Bachelor of Sport and Exercise Science students. You can see there that it wasn't the entire cohort. So this was basically a resultant of those that opted in, but then also who were in attendance. We would have liked to have seen, I guess, a bit higher in week one, but, you know, that's just the realities of uni timetabling and students finding their way amongst many other things. So basically that group went through the workshop and completed the questionnaires, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then our control group was our Diploma of Sports Coaching students who did not partake in the workshops in semester one. However, for transparency and equality, we gave them the same experience just recently in the last couple of weeks, but they weren't part of the actual study in terms of, we weren't measuring the effect of those workshops. They just got to have fun on pogo sticks and unicycles because we thought it might be something they would like to do. All right, so now I'm going to hand to Luke, who is the brains behind the design, and he can talk through the actual workshop itself.
Yeah, okay.
I can stand and push buttons.
This is the easy part because most of you here were part of this, and so you guys know, at least for the circuit session, exactly what was going on. There were three aspects of the workshop. There was the lecture, there was the circuit session, and then there were the weekly reminders. So in terms of the lecture, the idea was to try and make it as interactive as possible. Thankfully, it wasn't just me talking at them for an hour. What we had were, we started off with a few videos. So in particular, a TED Talk by Angela Lee Duckworth, who's a professor talking about grit. And then maybe something that's a bit more sort of at a first year level. It was the NBA player, this guy, discussing failure. And so obviously basketball is a quite popular sport around here. So I think they appreciated that one maybe a little bit more than the other. We had videos and we talk about them and ask them sort of what they thought about it. We then moved into this ball and bucket task. And so we had two students kindly volunteer, a little bit after I incentivized it with some chocolate, but two volunteers. And I basically said, your task is to throw these 5 balls into that bucket over there. That's it. You take whatever you want after that, it's up to you. And so I believe the first girl went up and she basically just dropped them into the bucket. And the second student, he did actually challenge himself. He threw from a little bit further away. And then we basically had this discussion about, okay, like, why did you feel like you had to just go really close? Now, part of the answer is because I wanted to get them in. And, you know, that's a fair enough answer, but it's kind of the point we're trying to get is, okay, why not always challenge yourself? Okay. Were you scared of failing in front of the other 100 students that were here, first week that you've ever met them, probably the first day you've ever met them? Completely understandable, okay? But just getting them thinking about this idea of fear of failure, challenging themselves, always wanting to sort of do the best they can, but not also being afraid of missing the target. Then this idea of Fermiizing problems. This is basically a little strategy, a little activity where you give them a nonsensical question, deliberately challenging, and they are inevitably confused. Okay, so in this instance, it was how many piano tuners are there in Melbourne? They don't know where to begin, and this reflects many things that might occur to them throughout their life at university, particularly assessments. They don't know where to begin. But then we talk them through how actually you can break down many of these questions, many of these challenges into smaller, more manageable chunks. And if you just give it a go, actually research shows that in processes such as this, your accumulation of guesses actually tend to balance each other out. So in this instance, you might underestimate the population of Melbourne, but you might overestimate how many people own a piano. And if you do that sort of 4 or 5 times, which you can't really see here on this screenshot, but which I go through the process, you end up with not too bad an answer. But even if you do end up with an answer that's miles away, if you approach a lecturer and say, look, I've tried with this assessment, I'm really, really stuck, but I've given this a go and I'm miles away. I think I can speak for us when we say, we don't mind. Okay. What's worse is when they go, don't know what I'm doing. Can't do it. It's tough. I don't even know where to begin. And so essentially, that activity taught them through all of that and how that would relate to potential challenges that they may get to later on down the road. And then the next one was this idea of a university pre-mortem. Now, pre-mortem activity has been taken from sort of the business domain, this idea that before engaging with a long-term project, you gather people together, people members in that of that project, and you get them to discuss, okay, imagine that the project has failed. Whatever it is, imagine it's been a complete disaster. Now let's brainstorm together what are the reasons for that failure, and just kind of trying to make it real and put themselves in that sort of hypothetical scenario. So we had the students do that with, which is probably a little bit of an interesting idea, first week of university, making them imagine that they failed at university. But they did it, and hopefully identifying some of the reasons why they might fail, or why they might be challenged at university, at least gives them that awareness, and then hopefully that awareness will help them sort of in the future. And then finally, sort of just on the previous one, we ended with some staff stories. So we had 8 academic staff talking about the story. So myself, Kate, and Maris. Maris, oh, everyone knows Maris, right? Just no longer here with us. We talked in person, and then we had 5 amazing videos by certain people in this room, which I'll show you. Min's one now. But yes. Min's one, if anyone does want to watch it, I can email you now.
Or you can ask about this in question time. Yeah.
So yeah, and so those stories were just sort of our own experiences of failure and sort of the way we've learned from that and stuff like that. Circuit session, this one I'll fly through because you guys do know most of this. We basically had 6 fun but deliberately difficult tasks. So making them fail, basically. Sometimes you'd find someone who could play the musical instrument, the keyboard, and that's fine. Sometimes people could juggle. Sometimes some people were good at art. But on the whole, there's 6 stations here where most people fail, okay? But that's fine. That's the idea. We're trying to get them to fail. We're trying to get them to fail in a fun way and also in a collaborative way. So I think the only station here really when they're not working as a team is pretty much that music one up there. Everything else we're sort of trying to encourage collaboration, some teamwork, working together, getting to know each other as well. The other section of the circuit session is that they were working in those teams and we gave them a team name. And the other aspects, so by the time they get round all 6 stations and at the end of the circuit session, their job was to explain to the rest of the class why they think their team name was their team name. So for example, Team Montreal 76 is after the Australian Olympic team's performance at the Montreal 76 Olympics. And the idea is that they talk about how Australia failed essentially at those Olympics, but that was the catalyst for the development of the AIS, which is essentially why Australia are so good at sport now. Pains me to say that, by the way. And they do pretty much figure it out as we get through to the end, and it's quite a nice way of then talking in front of others as well. And there's just some pictures, just some included, just to demonstrate the pogo, the music, the unicycling, great teamwork on the unicycling, the art, the brain station, which was a Rubik's Cube, Sudoku, and a crossword, and then a bit of juggling as well. I think as Kate hinted at as well, and as Marlena, who probably knows this area more so than all of us combined, one of the big things with these sorts of interventions is that the longer they run, the more intense they are, the more effective they are. Okay, so a one hit of this sort of thing doesn't tend to be that effective, but if you can sort of repeat the message and repeat the themes over time and prolong it, then it tends to be more effective. So what we did is we had these weekly reminders between weeks 2 and 11, where I basically posted on the LMS something to do with the themes from the workshop. So maybe something from the lecture, maybe something from the circuit session. And I was trying to make them, again, as interactive as possible, or some challenges, something that would get the students to engage with them. So, for example, I found 16 pieces of artwork that I thought were quite good, and I turned it into a little round robin where they had to vote for which ones, and eventually we went through this little knockout tournament and they got to vote on which was their favorite piece of art from the circuit station. And then another week, for example, I gave them a new nonsensical question to Fermi's as well.
All right, so thanks, Luke. So yeah, I guess from that, obviously that was the intervention of what we were trying to achieve, and then it came down to measuring the effectiveness, as we sort of mentioned before. So in terms of how we attempted to do that, so the participants completed 7 questionnaires, all just sort of in one. So at the end of the day, they had to sit down and fill out this questionnaire, which looked at 9 different measures of psychological characteristics, the ones that we mentioned before. And we also asked them some qualitative questions in terms of what did they enjoy, what didn't they enjoy, had they actually learned anything from that, and then do they perceive the workshop to have changed their approach to university? So we'll get to some of the results in a minute in terms of what they said to those, but really we were hoping to really tease out, if we didn't find anything in terms of the questionnaires, was there anything else that we could really take away to see whether the students felt that this was something that they, had benefited from. And then in terms of the data analysis, so in looking at the questionnaire data, we used a linear mixed model to look at the change over time, as well as comparing differences between the control group, so the Carlton cohort, to those that had been involved in the workshop. And then we also did a thematic analysis on the 4 questions mentioned there to see what key themes that we could basically generate from those surveys. So now we're going to go through essentially the results of that before I hand to Luke, who will look at the secondary findings in terms of looking at task enjoyment and perceived competence. So this is what we found. Not a lot, to be honest. So between, in terms of looking at the quantitative analysis, we had no significant group difference for any of the 9 outcomes, but we did, however, have significant time and interaction effects for some of the outcomes. So yeah, you can see here that a lot of it doesn't look like much has changed, but when we sort of delve deeper into why, we're pretty confident we know why or why not we saw these changes. So first up, the actual theory about resilience is extremely complex, so making it challenging to actually define and evaluate and work out how we actually are going to measure this. And then also with that, we didn't really have a lot to go of in terms of measuring the impact throughout semester, as we mentioned before. We tried attendance, but then we looked at the fact that the GSE attendance is associated with an assessment. We actually had pretty good attendance, which I'm not complaining about, but it made looking at whether that actually was, student-led quite challenging. And then, yeah, also with grades, it didn't really correlate much that we were comfortable with that. In terms of the perfectionism, so we found that students, what came through with these results is they did feel that pressure to master these tasks, particularly in week one. So that fear of, I guess, non-acceptance or, making themselves feel silly in front of others. We found that perfectionism may have led to that sort of no change or perhaps feeling of not quite, essentially still having that feeling, even though we had given them an environment that we deemed to be safe. And also looking at the two different demographics, Luke and I had quite a few discussions about this in terms of, in theory, they should be roughly the same demographic, but we know, and for those of you who have taught the Carlton cohort students or seen them around, they have additional support in terms of how comfortable they are with each other and the fact that they do every class together. It's block timetabled. They have Carlton social sort of support around their degree as well. So in terms of, I guess, how the two groups were feeling about university and starting something new, we've probably already got a lot of biases there that are going to influence, we're not necessarily, it's not as standardized as we would have liked. So yeah, we definitely just sort of have to think about that, I think, in nature of how they also perceive pressures. So the Carlton group, some of them haven't sat year 12 exams. They've come in sort of alternate pathways. So again, they might perceive things to be either not as stressful as the bachelor students, or perhaps, ignorance is bliss in that sense. So yeah, again, a lot for us to unpack there. And then finally, in terms of, we were looking at, was there a valid, quick and reliable tool specific for university students? Lo and behold, there wasn't. So we tried to find something that would work in that instance, but we do need to know that, I guess, the application versus like the tool in which who we're applying it to needs to be taken into consideration there. So yeah, lots to pick apart, which is why we basically need to do this either for a longer duration, as Luke said, to get more meaningful data, or look underneath the surface of those qualitative questions, which is what we're going to do now. Before we do that, though, we'd like to think of it as a glass half full approach. So I guess, what does it all mean and what can it tell us, even if we don't see a huge difference in results? As we sort of spoke about there, that, we need a better way to quantify and measure the academic engagement. The reduction in perfectionism might be a good thing. So, and then also the workshop did prevent the experimental group from becoming more fixed in their mindset. So again, we didn't see a negative effect there. So maybe, hopefully, that's a good thing. And the fact that there wasn't a change in tenacity from a practical perspective might be a good thing too. So yeah, just sort of, I guess, reading between the lines there a little bit. But let's take a quick look at what they actually had to say. So after the qualitative analysis, essentially sort of 5 key themes came out. Social connection and teamwork was a massive one. So hopefully you can all read that. If not, we can definitely send it around. So it was some really good, I guess, in-depth examples in what the students had put in their long answers that really sort of exemplified that. So unanimously across most of the students who completed this question, the fact that they were working in teams and the fact that they had then identified that they weren't alone and everybody was having similar challenges was a really big theme to come through with their questionnaire results. And I think, yeah, these I just sort of picked a few out there that really highlight that. So using the strengths of others, I think, is a massive one. And, hopefully that's something that we can all appreciate, would hopefully feed forward into academic studies. But then also fulfilling your role within the bigger picture as well. The unicycle space was the one space that they really sort of came together there. But yeah, really sort of breaking down that fear of being on your own. The growth through discomfort. So many of them learn the value of pushing beyond their comfort zones, getting to meet new people, making them feel comfortable. So breaking that barrier down. And then also this student here commenting on, why failure is important and that shouldn't stop you trying again. So again, a lot of the time we're seeing with some students that is a barrier for them. So it was nice to hear that, they sort of just kept going at each station, even if they weren't getting the result they'd hoped for. Building resilience. So this student basically, yeah, again, really highlighted there that, it was the task that they weren't doing well in, that they really had that sort of light bulb moment, and that they actually did, in fact, enjoy the learning process. Pogo and juggling. So this is sort of the back end of a comment. One student said that prefacing this was that the two stations they already knew how to do. Naturally, they liked. But they found that they actually surprised themselves with giving it a red hot crack for those that didn't. And that for those that were involved in these stations, you would have seen that they all walked over to the unicycle and essentially gawked at it and said, I can't do that. But by the end of that sort of 10, 15, they were all sort of wheeling themselves around the court. So again, a nice demonstration there. And then finally, we asked them, yeah, what could we improve? Most of them were pretty in agreement with the fact that we'd designed a nice workshop and, a good activities. However, what came through quite strongly, apart from needing to wear an arts mock and having a warning on the pogo stick for bruises, was that more sport-related activities, which again probably doesn't come as much of a surprise to us. And then I think interestingly the teamwork ones were the ones that they really liked. So even if they learnt something on the music station, they said, it wasn't that great because I sort of did it by myself. So yeah, just a nice real spread there, I guess, that it's coming through in that narrative that, they are taking something away from it. And at least getting them to think about, failure in a different light there. All right, back to you, Luke.
Yeah, so the main, Kate gone through the main study, the primary goal with this workshop, but part of me also wanted to explore the idea of the relationship between task enjoyment and perceived competence, and so that's why we kind of included a few extra questions in that second half. So we also, as well as the ones that Kate just mentioned before, we also asked them to rate their enjoyment of each station from 1 to 10. And also how well they believed they performed, so individually as opposed to as a team, on each of those. And then we also asked 2 more questions. If you had 10 more minutes to do one of the stations again, which would you pick? And if you had one station to not pick again, which would it be? Sorry. And this is partly just out of my interest. I thought this would be quite a cool thing to look into. Easy to add on, right? There's a little few extra questions, not much harm in it. So that's what we kind of addressed here. Not everyone did it. So obviously of the 117 students that completed the circuits, 110 responded to the station to repeat. 102 responded to the station to avoid, which might be, I think actually a few of them did say that they would do them all again. So that's why a few of them chose not to answer that one. And then we just got the males and females and the mean ages. Now, I've got an image of Vegemite here because the analysis was to take the 2 that are most Marmite. And then I said this to Kate, and she was like, that phrase doesn't work in Australia.
I didn't know what it meant.
It's basically Vegemite. So the 2 that people either loved or they hated. Maybe it's just an English thing to say. But clearly does not apply with Vegemite. But what we did is, yeah, maybe they just
Anyway.
moving on. So we basically looked at the unicycle and the art. So the people that said that they would repeat or avoid the unicycle, and the people that said that they would repeat or avoid the art station, and to look at what they put down for their enjoyment and competence. And this is all probably quite obvious, but there's nothing really that actually shows this in literature. And even obvious things kind of have to be sort of shown, I guess. The enjoyment one is really obvious, right? If you enjoy something, then you're more likely going to want to repeat it. And if you don't enjoy it, you're more likely to avoid it. So this sort of difference between 3.5 and 8.8 and then 4.6 and 8.4, that's the obvious stuff, right? But it is interesting that despite the fact that we've spent the previous week spending a whole lecture on how failure's okay for you, it's okay, you can be resilient, it's a good thing, you can learn a lot from it, and they've just spent a whole hour and a half doing these circuit sessions where we've been demonstrating those themes even more, that actually they're avoiding the tasks that they're rubbish at, and they're wanting to repeat the tasks that they're really good at. And maybe you can't blame them. Maybe that's like, okay, maybe we do the same. But it is interesting still. And again, the same applies for the art one. Maybe a little bit more very small gap there, just 3.8 to 6.3. The issue, I guess, is that in itself, this doesn't necessarily show us too much. What we really need going forwards is to compare this to a group that don't have all those themes emphasized to them. So I guess going forwards from now, actually, sorry, give me a second, I'll come back to what I was about to say. We also looked at the correlations. So again, what we're looking at here is this correlation between competence and enjoyment. So unicycle, pogo, juggling, brain, music and art, all of those stations, obviously very strong correlations as to be expected. More just out of interest, there was interesting relationships found between the unicycle and pogo, and then also between the brain, music and art. So I guess we're getting like a cluster of types of activity that people like and enjoy, and that they think they're good at. And then I guess a weird one between where there's a negative relationship between pogo and unicycle and art and music as well. So that's very much just this is fairly interesting, at least to me, perhaps. As I was saying before, so what are the next steps with this? I guess this becomes more interesting and more relevant if we can compare it to a group that hasn't had those themes emphasized them. So the plan is basically for next year, using the SBE 1001 subject, which I'm a big fan of, is to give them this in first week, but without giving them the lecture first, so give them the lecture afterwards, without telling them and emphasizing those themes throughout the circuit session, and without calling it a resilience circuit session. So basically giving them the same things, but without the emphasis, and seeing whether those relationships between competence and enjoyment are as strong, or perhaps stronger, we would hypothesize perhaps stronger, when you don't do that. So essentially the research question becomes, does this educational workshop, this resilience workshop, focusing on resilience, the benefits of failure and a growth mindset, impact the relationship between task enjoyment and perceived task competence? And maybe if we find that relationship is reduced following a mindset intervention, a resilience workshop, then maybe there is something that we can look at going forward in terms of sort of applied implications of that. So yes, I will be asking for your help again, pretty much every year until I leave the Trobe. So yes, so the overall takeaway is minimal quantitative evidence for the effectiveness of the workshop, but I would say quite strong evidence, qualitative evidence for it. And this qualitative evidence also sort of perhaps more so shows how important this could be just as an icebreaker and as something to sort of first week, first term, their first year, getting them to know their their peers, getting them to know their academic staff. So I think that's a real big help and a real big sort of, thumbs up for this workshop, irrespective of the other aspects that maybe were the initial hopes with it. And then whether or not we find this enjoyment and competence going hand in hand next year, that will find that, and that will sort of add to that secondary study that we're looking at in terms of enjoyment and competence. So maybe this time next year we'll be coming back and talking about the second one again. We got listed everyone who helped out, so really appreciate that. But a massive thank you to Kate as well, who isn't on that list, but pretty much.
All right, I got a title slide.
And I really appreciate it. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.